so much for being here. My name is Mehlaqa Samdani. I am the Director of Critical Connections, a nonprofit organization here in Western Massachusetts that builds community awareness and empowerment around issues affecting American Muslims and other targeted communities. Our program today is part of our Critical Issues in Context series, which takes a deep dive into contentious issues of relevance to citizens in both Muslim majority and minority contexts. We are very grateful to the Markham Nathan Fund for Social Justice for making this series possible. So now we're going to turn to our event today, Islam and the question of religious minorities. In many Muslim majority countries, from the Middle East to South Asia to parts of Africa, religious and sectarian minority groups are targets of structural and societal persecution and discrimination. And they're also subjected to extremist violence. There are those who believe that this intolerance is rooted in religious doctrine, while others believe that it is historical, social, and political processes in post-colonial Muslim states that are responsible for this phenomenon. And despite the fact that many non-Muslim citizens in Muslim majority countries are treated like second-class citizens, any discussion around the rights of religious minorities is often stifled and looked upon with a lot of mistrust and suspicion, given the fact that historically and even in contemporary times, Western powers have used the religious freedom agenda to advance their own interests. Here in the US, it has also been difficult to engage in these conversations because of growing Islamophobia. However, our goal today is really to create a safe space where we can engage in a nuanced conversation around this very sensitive topic and empower American Muslims and our allies in information that is contextualized. And to help us navigate all of this, we are joined by an extremely illustrious group of panelists. So first we have Dr. Tasneem Alkiek, who has a PhD in Islamic Studies with a focus on the development of Islamic law from Georgetown University. She completed her undergraduate degree in early Christianity and Islamic Studies at the University of Michigan. Tasneem serves as the Director of Expanded Learning at Yaqeen Institute, where she works with her team to create curricula and other resources for communities to engage with Yaqeen's research. Next, we have Professor Mohammad Fadel, who is a professor at the Faculty of Law, University of Toronto, which he joined in January 2006. Professor Fadel wrote his PhD dissertation on legal process in medieval Islamic law while at the University of Chicago and received his JD from the University of Virginia School of Law. He serves on the boards of the National Association of Muslim Lawyers and Muslim Advocates. Professor Fadel has published numerous articles in Islamic legal history and Islam and liberalism. Last but not least, we have Professor Daniel Philpott, who is Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. He earned his PhD in 1996 from Harvard University and specializes in religion and global politics, focusing on religious freedom, reconciliation, the political behavior of religious actors, and Christian political theology. His monographs include Just and Unjust Peace, An Ethic of Political Reconciliation, by Oxford, and Religious Freedom in Islam, The Fate of a Universal Human Right in the Muslim World. Before we turn to our panel, I'm going to quickly go over our format. I'm going to ask, for the first half of the event, I'm going to ask our panelists a series of questions, after which we will open it up for audience Q&A. And so now, without further ado, I will now turn to our speakers and welcome them all to our discussion. So Tasneem, let me turn to you first, and I will ask you to give us some foundational context here. What guidance do the Quran and prophetic tradition provide around the treatment of religious minorities?
Thank you, Mehlaqa, and thank you for having me here tonight. Excited to talk about this really important topic. And really I want to do is, as you mentioned, is provide that context as to where these conversations begin. But before even getting into that, I think it's important to put ourselves in the mindset of of 7th century Arabia and most of the world up until a couple of centuries ago, which was one in which religious identity was the primary identity that people identified by, and that really empires were ruled and civilizations were ruled by. And so when it comes to now the Muslim community and the prophetic community, the Prophet, when he becomes a political leader and has started to establish that rule, that religious identity is going to take front center stage. And so there are a couple of really foundational texts that define that. Number one, you have the Prophet's experience when the Muslims essentially conquer the city of Medina. And at the time, there was a large Jewish community there. In fact, there were several tribes there. And what the Prophet essentially establishes is what is known today as the Charter of Medina, that it was a contract between the Muslims and the Jewish tribes as to how they were going to really conduct one another. And essentially what it entailed was that in exchange for essentially a lack of treason and essentially working together against a common enemy, that the Jewish tribes would contribute to this military fund, that they were going to protect the Jews, and that they were willing to offer them financial aid, to protect them from common enemies, and to live side by side, and that the Jewish communities can continue living as their own separate community. And this is really important because this becomes the foundation as to what ends up becoming actually Islamic law very shortly thereafter. And this is where you see the solidification. There's the revelation of verses thereafter that really take this precedent and then codify them into law. And so then afterwards, you have a verse in the Quran, as well as later Islamic law that develops around it, around two key concepts. And those the first concept is that of dhimma. And this word dhimma, which literally means protection or protected, comes in various forms. In one way, we see it as ahlul dhimma, the people, the protected people. You see it in its longer form of dhimmatullahi wa rasulihi, the protection of God and his prophet. And essentially what that label is used is to identify those who contract with the Muslim, at this point, ruling party, and again, abide by those same contractual notions, that in exchange for military protection, in exchange for physical protection, and in many cases, financial aid, and the ability for, really that loyalty to the ruling party, that religious minority groups were guaranteed to be able to continue abiding by their laws and practicing within their communities unharmed, but also protected by foreign enemies. And so essentially the Muslims, what ends up becoming the Muslim state later on, is there to offer both that security and justice in exchange for what is then known as the jizya. And the jizya is the famous tax that raises red flags immediately when mentioned, that this is what is supposedly referred to as a discriminatory tax, but as we know, this was something that was paid simply in exchange for that military protection. And so these two concepts really serve as the foundation, as we see later on throughout Islamic civilizations, as to how religious minorities are to be treated, and their abilities in terms of the rights they are able to maintain.
Great, excellent. Thank you for that context. So then, after the Prophet passed away, then, the Islamic legal tradition slowly began to develop. And so could you talk a little bit about how classical jurists and classical scholarship treated the question of religious minorities in Muslim lands? And as you do that, could you also sort of explain to those who don't know what the classical period refers to? Like, what time period are we talking about?
Well, I think, in fact, classical period could, depending on really, I think it depends on how you want to break up Islamic history. But in fact, I don't think I will stick to the classical period, because I think that the way it's, which would be essentially almost the first few centuries post 7th century, but in fact, look up into the very latest Islamic caliphate, which is the Ottoman Empire, because I think they give us sort of the crystallization of everything coming together. And what Muslim jurists do is they look at this precedent set, but they also look at other, obviously other factors. And one factor is the Pact of Umar, who was the second caliph in Islamic civilization. And that essentially when the Muslims conquered Syria, they created a similar contract between the Christians in Syria with the Muslims. And really this is another foundational piece that serves as this concept of religious autonomy. And this is what happens throughout, essentially the rest of Islamic history, is this idea that religious minorities are not to be persecuted under contract by any means, and in fact can maintain their religious autonomy and function as separate groups. And this becomes important because essentially what happens with the Ottoman Empire, which I think is a great example because they are the longest standing Islamic caliphate that ruled over 600 years and one of the last to exist. Because what that ends up looking like in reality is something called what they call the millet system, which is essentially what millet means, the religious community system, where religious communities are they come together and they actually elect a patriarch to represent them, and that patriarch serves as a liaison between him and the ruling authority. And so if there's any complaints within that community, that it would go then to the patriarch, who would then take it to the Muslim community. But the point really is that they were able to maintain their laws, and this is something that's extremely important because there was no there was no attempted mass conversions or mass persecutions for the sake of religious differences, purely for the sake of religious differences. And I think this is important. I mean, in fact, you even have some caliphs and caliphates that were opposed to religious minorities converting because it meant that they get less money for taxes, for military taxes. That once you become Muslim, you pay not the jizya tax, but you pay something considered the zakat tax, which that money goes to the poor, not to the military. So politically, it was very inconvenient when people became Muslim, and that was sort of a financial loss. And so that concept of forced persecution, as particularly when you're a protected community, is entirely absent. And I think that's particularly profound when you consider historically, I mean, the various inquisitions that were held under religious communities and the persecution that was held widely, but that system of religious autonomy was maintained. And that, in fact, I think one really good example that I like to think about to offer is as early as the Umayyad Caliphate, which was one of the very first caliphates in the Islamic Empire. What was happening was that the Jewish communities, the Christian communities were allowed to maintain their laws and their essentially their religious courts. So much, but with the caveat that if the Jews or the Christians in those communities want to go to Muslim courts for legislation, that they are more than welcome to do so. And so you have Jewish women in the Umayyad period who, at the time, had they sought divorce in rabbinical courts, they would lose their property rights. So naturally, they would turn to then the Muslim courts, which would not require a forfeiture of your property rights upon divorce. And so this becomes a problem for the Jewish community because, again, that religious autonomy and that functioning was something that was prized and valued. And in fact, that there was then a rabbinic decree issued at the time that prevented that loss, just in order to maintain that autonomy and also the exclusive jurisdiction. And so I think that's something that was very much valued in many ways, that ability to continue that functioning. There's plenty more to say on that, but I think that is really just the general image that we have historically of religious minorities within Muslim communities.
Excellent. Thank you for giving us that sense of how the Islamic legal tradition evolved around that. So let's bring it to the present times. I mean, how have contemporary Muslim scholars engaged with this question?
So I think when it comes to particular Muslim scholars, I think Dr. Fadel will have plenty to contribute on this, but just generally, I think that and you mentioned it in the introduction, I think that a lot of this becomes less of a question about religion and law, but more so about the post-colonial world that the Muslim world is essentially inherits. And I think when you look back as you see the sort of the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries, the slow and gradual decline, what you find is that in order to sort of cater to the needs of the changing and the globalizing world, that there was a period of reforms known as the Tanzimat reforms, in which the Ottoman Empire wanted to essentially catch up with what they saw as the Western world racing ahead. And in the various reforms that eventually allowed, that not allowed, but that abolished the millet system in favor of concepts of citizenry, of equal citizenship. When you look at those in context, also in context of even Western notions of sovereignty and in nation states and citizenship, I mean, it was never really out of interest, out of religious, diversity and tolerance, that we're not going to now institute citizenry simply because we want people to be equal, but it was obviously about loyalty to the state and how you can create that state sovereignty in a way that was more binding. And so I say that because, again, I think that's important for the context today, that the context is not, it's not about religion by any means alone. And that is just one very small piece of the conversation. In general, though, a lot of Muslim scholars today have openly talked about the different ways of how citizenry can look today. And that many scholars, in fact, in 2016, it was very sort of famous gathering of various scholars, but also political leaders. And I think that, again, that's important because it's, again, not just an issue of religion, very much a political gathering in which there was this official signature of Muslim dignitaries and notaries and scholars who came together and said that going back to that prophetic charter of Medina, that is something that we want to bring back to life today, that essentially everyone is protected and that no one is harmed and no one is persecuted, which is fine, which is great, in fact. But the reality of on the ground, I think, is vastly different, because it's not simply a question of religion. And you have that very, most religious scholars today will, well, I shouldn't say most, but a vast majority or many scholars today will openly talk about citizenship as the natural understanding. And so I think that that's important because when they talk about the debates over citizenry, it's really not, it's more of a political discussion and not religious discussion. So I will leave it with that and allow Professor Fadel to get into the political details of that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tasneem. I'm sure there will be follow-up questions around the Marrakesh Declaration that you referred to and other aspects that you touched. So, Professor Fadel, let me turn to you. Tasneem touched upon this notion of citizenship. And could you give us a sense of how this notion of citizenship evolved in the Muslim world and what its impact was on the theological discourse surrounding the rights of religious minorities and religious freedom?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, we really have to understand what does the idea of a citizen mean, right? I mean, I think the idea of a citizen itself is a really thick concept from the perspective of political theory with a very long history, right? Going back to the Greek city-state with the ideal of the self-governing citizen, the citizen who participates in making rules, as Aristotle said, ruling and being ruled in turn. Right now, this idea of the citizenship, the ideal of the citizen first sort of manifested itself in the city-state. Right now, there are many ways, if we're looking at Islamic history, that you can look at Medina as a kind of city-state, in which people participated very directly in government and they took turns ruling and being ruled. Now, when Islam expands and is no longer a city-state, there are radical transformations because the ordinary Muslim is no longer participating in governing the empire, right? It's imperial, it's no longer a republic, so to speak, right? So when we use the word citizen, we have to we shouldn't forget the kind of Republican origins of the idea of a citizen. And so I would argue that one of the biggest problems we have in the Muslim world is that, we generally don't have citizens. We still have subjects. What I mean by that is that for the vast majority of the Muslim world, people are subjects. They don't really participate actively in self-government. So the ideal of citizenship is not really manifested in tangible practice. So it's more of a kind of, idea on paper that doesn't necessarily have a sociological reality or a political reality. And so it becomes very hard, I think, for people to understand what religious freedom as a political ideal means, because they themselves don't experience the political ideal of being a citizen, right? So there's a great Indian politician, actually, who was pointing to this. This was during the end of the British Empire, British rule over India. And he was saying that the dilemma facing modern Muslim publics is that historically, Muslim political thought has addressed two different situations. One in which Muslims are rulers, and so they rule themselves and they rule others. And then the other situation is when others rule Muslims, right? But they haven't theorized what it means to rule alongside other people. And that's ultimately what sort of the idea of democracy is that you are ruling with and through other people, as opposed to either ruling them or being ruled by them, right? And so it's this idea of shared sovereignty that citizenship gets to. And I think it's as a political ideal, it's very much, it's still very much of an ideal to be realized in the Muslim world. Not to say that it's ideal, that it's manifested very well in the United States for that matter, right? But certainly the ideals of citizenship are much more practiced in daily life in the United States than they are in a place like Egypt, sort of my native country, right? And so I think one of the biggest obstacles to religious freedom in the Muslim world is not so much theological issues, although theology, I think, is a serious problem, but rather the lack of a real institutional framework for the exercise of citizenship, and the lack of practice of citizenship in fact, right? And so as a result, the idea of rights, of political rights, being really central to identity is pretty weak, right? And so, I'll just say, it's very awkward for a religion to endorse religious freedom, because a religion, at least like Islam or Catholicism, is coming to teach people what it claims to be true, and not just true about like mathematics, but something that's true for your most important truths in your existence, right? So from the internal perspective of a religion that makes claims like that, it obviously can't be indifferent to people's responses to it, right? So religious freedom really, from my perspective, is not something that comes internally from religion naturally, right? It's something that religion responds to in connection with specific institutional opportunities. Now, that doesn't mean to say that Islam can't flourish or Muslims couldn't endorse for good reasons religious freedom. But just like in the West, religious freedom was the product of a long history of evolution, right? We can't expect it to just manifest itself overnight in societies whose social realities are radically different, right? So, I can just talk about England. England had an established church, the Church of England, right? The only kind of religious freedom was the freedom to be a member of the Anglican Church. And as a result, lots of English dissidents came to the United States, or came to be the United States. Over centuries, they began to tolerate particular religions. So okay, we'll recognize some other kinds of Protestants. Then grudgingly, they tolerated Catholics, then Jews, then Muslims, then Hindus. But it was a long time before there's a blanket principle of religious freedom. Religions were tolerated on a case-by-case basis, right? Subject to lots of qualifications. So I think one of the problems that we in the Muslim world face is that here we have a right that has ripened over, let's say, 300 years of political development in the West. And then all of a sudden, people expect that to be manifested and practiced in the same way in the rest of the world, where they haven't experienced the same kind of history or the same kind of opportunities, right? It's one thing to live in a society where average household income is $60,000, $65,000 a year. Totally different in a society of where median household income is $1,000, and you need to depend on a wide circle of people for your daily existence, right? The role of religion is going to play a very different role sociologically in those two different kinds of societies, right? And presumably, religious freedom can be a lot more consequential in a society that's just above subsistence, whereas in a very affluent society, a lot more dissent can be tolerated, right? Now, so that's just kind of a general view. Now, if we look at sort of particular things, I think one thing that's very important is of course extremely important. Some of the things that Sister Tasneem was mentioning, right? But we have to keep in mind a very, very important difference in how Islam structured toleration of non-Muslims as compared to, let's say, the United States Constitution. So the US Constitution establishes legal neutrality between and among religions. What Islamic law does is that it says, we are going to treat non-Muslims as Muslims for purposes of secular law. So we will give them the same rights and obligations that Muslims have, but we will exempt them from those aspects of Muslim law that have to do with religion. Okay, so they're not accountable to the state for paying zakat or prayer or fasting or anything like that, but they are accountable to behave to obey the criminal laws, the laws of property, contract, tort, et cetera, because from the perspective of Islamic law is treating them as though they are Muslims for all these spheres. So it's the commitment to the religious law that accords them rights and status. And so it's very hard to translate a secular conception of religious freedom into an Islamic language, because I'm talking about Islamic political language, because from the perspective of Islamic law, right, all rights and duties flow from Islamic law. If you follow what I'm saying, right? So whereas neutrality is what guarantees religious freedom in the US constitutional system, in the historical Islamic system, it was Islamic law that guaranteed certain freedoms and rights for non-Muslims, right? And so the modern sort of criticism of Islamic public order is that it's based on Islamic law, but that's the historical development of the Muslim world, right? So if you remove that, from the internal perspective of Muslim societies, it's hard to understand what the normative regulating principles are, right? I think one other point that's extremely important to understand is that the history of the Islamic world is one of very slow conversion to Islam. So it's misleading to talk about the rights of non-Muslim minorities in Islamic law, because historically, the rules that were articulated about non-Muslims were done at a time when Muslims were a vanishingly small minority of the population. So they might have been 1% of the population of the empire they governed, or 2% at the time that they were making these rules, right? So a lot of rules like you can't build churches in Muslim cities, et cetera, right? I mean, part of it was they wanted to maintain the integrity of Muslim space at a time when Muslims, like I said, were a vanishingly small minority, right? So, those are kinds of easy things to say, oh, well, that's sort of obsolete rules, right? So we should be able to get rid of those very easily. But the bigger source of conflict, I think, is that modern ideals of religious freedom descend from a certain ideal of the secularity of the state, like the religious neutrality of the state, whereas the Islamic genealogy of religious freedom descends from Islamic law and the idea of treating people as though they were Muslims.
That's a very interesting concept, Professor Fadel. Thank you so much for enlightening us around that particular topic. But I'm also wondering if you could talk a little bit about, and you've sort of talked about the historical way that Islamic law was applied when the Muslim population was extremely small. But in the current context, I mean, we know that religious institutions like Al-Azhar and others around the Muslim world have really tried to, you spoke about religion responding to this notion of religious freedom, but they have also responded to current developments around democracy, around human rights. And I'm wondering how they have developed, or if at all they have developed a discourse around the rights of religious minorities in Muslim majority countries where Muslims are in the majority.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think they would say in general that non-Muslims should be entitled to all the rights that Islamic law guarantees them. And they should be entitled to all the rights that international human rights law guarantees them, provided that international human rights law doesn't contradict Islamic law, right? And so this is what I'm saying where the tension is that indigenous Muslim leaders, like religious leaders at least, right, want to condition international human rights norms based on internal norms of Islam, whereas I guess, those who come from a human rights perspective want to condition Islam on the human rights norm, right? So that's why there's the conflict. It's an issue of what should be supreme when there's a conflict, right?
Excellent. Okay, so I am going to sort of move just a little bit forward around this issue. So, a 2013 Pew poll found that 88% of Egyptians and 62% of Pakistanis support the death penalty for apostasy or for those who have left the Islamic faith. This was also the majority view among Muslims in Jordan, in Palestine, and Malaysia. Do you believe that the classical legal tradition has played a role in shaping norms and values around religious freedom and the rights of religious minorities in Muslim majority countries? Given the fact that classical law was developed, again, at a time when modern notions of citizenship were not fully developed and the modern nation state did not exist, do you believe it's possible for Muslim jurists to arrive at notions of equal citizenship if they continue to work from within the tradition in places like Egypt and Pakistan?
Well, I mean, I think it's all possible. But what I was trying to say in sort of my first set of comments was that requires a lot of preconditions politically and socially that are right now, at least, aren't really present. Right.
And what is causing, what are the obstacles to making that transition?
The states in the Muslim world are extremely weak. Okay, so states cannot enforce their positive law. They don't have the means to enforce their positive law. So as a result, you can have all sorts of formal commitments, all sorts of rights, but in the countryside, if people ignore the law, and the state doesn't have the power to compel the population to follow it. And that can be the positive law of the state or Islamic law, for that matter, right? And so religious freedom is largely a result of a strong state that can guarantee religious freedom, because the state can provide security outside of the basic communal structures. So what I'm trying to say, in much of the Muslim world, it's communal structures that provide security, not the state. So repudiating these communal structures is obviously a very serious thing, right? And that's why majorities think that it should be punished, because they depend on certain values that are present in their communities to sustain them through difficult times, right? Not the state. The state is not a reliable source of protection, right? So, who cares about the law of the state, right? So until such time as you have strong, accountable, responsible government, in my opinion, it's very hard to imagine we can have a set of effective rights at all, including religious freedom, not just religious freedom, but all sorts of rights, right?
Right. But I mean, I think what you're saying then is that, notions of citizenship, whether, formally thought of in that way or not, are still based along religious lines. So citizenship is based on your religious identity still, from which security and justice and all of those other things flow. It's not based on this sort of legal neutrality kind of a notion.
Again, this is not,
and that's sort of continuing from Islamic law and the classical approach to it.
It's
right?
not peculiar to Muslim religious communities, right? Christian religious communities have the same sort of loyalty to the community, to the religious community over the entire the body politic, for the same reasons, is that your primary loyalty are to those people who will protect you in the crunch, right? And so until you can have really strong governments, strong legitimate governments that can work for the people and are accountable to the people, then formal rights that the state guarantees aren't going to be considered that valuable, right? So it's really not a question of theology. That's what I want to say. It's not that there aren't theological arguments about why, the penalty for apostasy isn't really about religion. That's not the point. The point is that for the average person in a place like Egypt, somebody who goes around claiming he's an atheist, that's not viewed as religious expression. That's viewed as saying, I don't care about you people, right? I'm not going to be there for you, if you understand what I'm saying, right?
Okay, excellent. I mean, there are going to be, I'm sure, lots of follow-up questions to that. Professor Fadel, thank you so much for your insights. We're going to move on to Professor Daniel Philpott to move into the next part of the discussion. And we'll come back to that notion later, I'm sure. So Professor Philpott, welcome. In your book, Religious Freedom in Islam, the Fate of a Universal Human Right in the Muslim World, you have divided Muslim majority states into 3 categories in terms of their approach to religious freedom. Could you describe these categories and what role religious doctrine plays in each category of states?
Well, thank you very much for having me here, Malaka, and welcome everyone. Thank you all for being here. It's a great honor to speak with you. So I want to answer that question, but let me just want to say a couple words on background on why I asked that question and why I made that division of Muslim majority states. So in my book, which was published in 2019, I sought to ask the question of the compatibility of religious freedom as a principle with Islam or the Muslim world. And you might ask, well, why does a Westerner, and I'm not a Muslim myself, I'm a Catholic Christian, why would I ask that question of Islam, and on what basis would I do that or have standing to do that? I asked the question out of being a long-standing scholar of religion and global politics, but also one who is immersed here in the West, where there seems to be almost a kind of a culture war or very fierce debate really over the last 20 years since the attacks of September 11th, but even farther back, over Islam. And so a very fierce debate after September 11th, but really every time there's some kind of incident in the world, could be an incident that is, say, a terrorist attack of some kind, but it also might be surrounding U.S. involvement in, say, Afghanistan or Iraq. Or but in all of these kinds of contexts, there arises a debate where you have one side, a kind of hawkish side, saying that we're involved in this violence or that attack occurred or and so forth because Islam is kind of a militant religion. It's a violent religion. It's hardwired for that because of its text and its teachings, and this is what to expect, and Western states should gird up for a kind of long struggle. But on the other hand, you have a more kind of dovish perspective, which is saying, no, it's not really about Islam. There are other causes for this, economic and legacies of colonialism, and Islam is really no better or worse than any other religion on these criteria. And and by saying it's Islam, you actually fuel the conflict that you're trying to fight, and they would favor an approach of dialogue and that sort of thing. So I decided, well, let's try to investigate this matter, and I adopted as my criterion the principle of religious freedom. It's one that both Dr. Alkiek and Professor Fadel made very insightful things to say about. In my perspective, religious freedom is a universal principle that it is embedded in the International Human Rights Conventions, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the various covenants and so forth. And while it is true that these human rights conventions have arisen at a certain time in history, the question is also, is it anything more than just a kind of artifact of these human rights conventions? And I would say yes, that religious freedom is in fact a universal principle, a universal moral principle. That's not an empirical claim. Religious freedom is not accepted everywhere or embedded everywhere or endorsed everywhere. But as a moral claim, I would argue that religious freedom is a universal principle, which is to say a human principle. It's a principle that is rooted in human dignity, in the dignity of the human person as a religious being who asks questions of ultimacy and adopts answers to them, often that are in the forms of religions. Many different religions around the world I believe, are expressing something that is fundamentally human, and to respect a person's religion and the person's practice of religion, belief in religion, search for religion, and the many different forms of practice and the forms of community, whether that's education or worship or what have you, is to respect religious freedom. And I think that principle is rightly embedded in the International Human Rights Conventions, and something that we should ask for all states to live up to, and hope to strive for a world in which every person would have that human right protected. And I think that it's certainly true that in the West we are facing new challenges of religious freedom, and it's a very fragile thing. It's something that I came to believe, and it's not something that the West has a monopoly on. I think in certain contexts it arose in the West in a very particular historical context, but the West has had very deep struggles with religious freedom, even right up to this day. Western countries, I mean. So I use this as a criterion and a principle then for looking at the Muslim world. And I particularly decided to look at Muslim majority states, countries whose populations are majority Muslim. And I thought that's a pretty good criterion, because for any kind of country, if you have a majority population that is of a particular religion, you sort of have an incentive not to be religiously free, right? Because then you have the kind of demographic power to say, our religion is going to rule the roost, and other minorities are not going to have full freedom to practice. Maybe we tolerate them, maybe we won't, and so forth. So it would be a pretty good kind of test, a pretty good criterion to look at Muslim majority countries. Are they religiously free? So what did I find? Finally getting to answer your question. So there are 47 of these countries in the world, give or take a few, depending on how you count. And what I found was that 11 of them passed the test of being religiously free, that are in fact great examples of religious freedom. How do I judge religious freedom? I use the criteria of the Pew Forum, which you mentioned a few minutes ago, Malaka, who has a very widely respected index for kind of ranking countries on their levels of religious freedom. So 11, about 1/4 of the countries do count as religiously free. Maybe one of the most interesting parts of those countries is what I call the West Africa 7. So it's on that coast of West Africa, that east-west coast, countries like Ghana and Sierra Leone and Senegal and Mali. And there you actually have very robust practice of religious freedom. And the interesting thing is these are strongly Muslim majority countries. Some are more than 95% Muslim, but also they're deeply devout. They have very high levels of religiosity. And that's interesting too, because many more secular people say, well, you're only going to have religious freedom where people are more secularized and westernized and that sort of thing. Well, that's not true in Western Africa. These are very religious, very devout people, and yet you also have religious freedom. So it's a very interesting set of cases, which I can come back to if you want to look at it more closely. But let me finish with my answer to your question. So if 1/4 of the countries in the Muslim majority world are free, what about the 3/4 who are not? Well, the typical Western image of countries, Islamic countries that are not free, is that they're Islamist. They're kind of called fundamentalists. They're highly religious. So we have Iran and Saudi Arabia and so forth come to mind. The mullahs are in charge. Well, in fact, that's not largely, well, it's in substantial degree not true. It turns out that 15 of those countries, remember 47 all in all, 11 free, but 15 of the countries that are not free are in fact what we might call secular repressive, meaning that their regimes are built around a kind of Western model. But it is not a Western model of freedom. It is a Western model of what we might call secularism or laïcité, to use the word from France. And so the standard here was Turkey, the Republic of Turkey, founded in 1923 by Kemal Ataturk. And he established a regime that is what I would call secular repressive. He wanted Turkey to be a modern nation like the West. He wanted it to be develop in science and rationality and develop economically, and to be militarily strong, to be nationalistic. So you would replace the kind of traditional Islamic notion with a notion of the Turkish nation, which would kind of take its place among the nations. And but it was to be secular. Religion was deemed to be a kind of irrational force that got in the way of progress. So he acted very forcefully, very frankly, rather repressively, to marginalize religious leaders and religious actors to make Turkey a secular nation. That's the principle on which Turkey was founded. Other countries followed suit. Egypt's Nasser, under Nasser in the 1950s, many Arab countries. And today, those are the countries that fit the secular repressive model. I would also add the post-Soviet republics of Central Asia, the Stans, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan and so forth. Now, that leaves, I haven't yet talked about the other 21. Well, they do, in fact, follow the, excuse me, the Islamist pattern. So there they are ruled by a kind of traditional Islamic government that wants to promote a traditional Islam, does so in a way that is, using the power of the state to do so. And there you have your Iran and Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan and Sudan and so forth. And that is a pattern that is there. But even there, I think it's important that kind of model of the nation state really came into being in the 20th century. It shouldn't be considered a traditional Islamic state. It's a modern creation, but where you have Islamist Muslims who want to very much use the nation state as a kind of vehicle or channel for building a kind of Islamic society, and often with the desire that it would spread. I mean, both Saudi Arabia and Iran seek very aggressively to spread their model to the rest of the world. So it's kind of like the in some ways similar to like the communist, where you had Marxist-Leninist states that established a state and then tried to spread it elsewhere. So that's the model, and I think it probably contains lessons for both the hawks and the doves. So one, you could say that the majority of the Muslim majority world is not religiously free. But when you go from a satellite view to a close-up view, you see that the reasons for it not being free are very complex and can sometimes be secular reasons. But we also see that there is 1/4 of the Muslim majority world that is in fact free, which I think is very significant.
Thank you for that nuanced analysis, Professor Philpott. I don't think a lot of people see it that way. You really provided some very useful categories to sort of understand how a lot of these countries operate and function when it comes to religious minorities. So, in your book, you believe that you've sort of written about how the Catholic Church's trajectory provides a really useful pathway and offers, a helpful pathway for perhaps the Muslim world to at least look at. And so could you elaborate on what that is?
Yes. Well, so this is my own religious community, which I've been very familiar with and studying. And the interesting thing is it has its own kind of history of coming to embrace religious freedom, a very complex pathway where for much of its history in the Middle Ages and into the early modern era, the period of the religious wars, it did not accept religious freedom. It thought that you could try to the ideal was to make the political realm one where the Catholic Church was established, but you could also use coercion to kind of enforce it where that wasn't those who were not Catholic. Now, the idea was never that you could convert people into religion through force, but rather that preserving the health of the political realm and of the faith meant preserving a kind of public Catholicism. And so the church held on to this even into the modern times, especially when it came to feel kind of under attack from the French Revolution, which is a very kind of assertively secular phenomenon. And so some of the 19th century popes can be heard kind of thundering against the principle of freedom because they associate it with a kind of model of aggressive secularism. But over time, some very important changes happen, and I think Professor Fadel is very insightful in saying that there are historical causes and conditions and changes and processes by which religious freedom comes about where it does. So finally, it was at the Second Vatican Council that the Catholic Church did proclaim religious freedom as a fundamental human right for every human being, and said that it's rooted in natural law or common principles of reason that any person can access. And so what I think is important, though, is that when the church came to proclaim religious freedom, it did so in a way that drew deeply upon its own resources. So it wasn't saying, all right, the secular French Revolution is right, we're going to go for religious freedom. Yes, it was true that religious freedom came about through a kind of dialogue with the world around it, through the secular world. But it was rooted in principles that were rooted in the Catholic faith, in both natural law, the tradition of reason, but also the religious understanding of the faith. And so it was able to come around to religious freedom, but not in a way that was secular or just kind of conforming to the secular world, but a way that was rooted in its own faith. And that's the sense in which I included that as a chapter in my book on religious freedom Islam, because I think that could also be a kind of pathway for Muslims that if they could have bases for religious freedom that are rooted in the Islamic tradition, that could be a solid way to establish it. And now there are some very important voices, such as scholars such as Mustafa Akyol, Abdullah Saeed, and others who are in fact making deeply Muslim arguments for religious freedom, rooting it in the tradition. And I think one of the big worries of many Muslims around the world about religious freedom is that it's really a kind of export from the West. Or they might look at Western societies and what they see as kind of individualism and license of various sorts and say, well, if religious freedom is part and parcel of that, that's something we don't want. They may see it as a form of kind of colonialism being imposed on them, or they might suspect that it's kind of a Trojan horse for Christian missionaries is also a common worry. But in fact, if religious freedom though has roots in the Muslim tradition, then this is something that could be authentically Muslim principle, just as the Catholic Church came to proclaim it, to be sure, as a universal principle, but one that could be understood and defended in roots in the Catholic tradition.
Right, and I think Tasneem also talked about some of those seeds within the Islamic tradition and how one can sort of cultivate that. I'm interested though, when the Catholic Church did come up with that proclamation around religious freedom, how impactful was that coming from the church in sort of setting some of the norms and values around this doctrine within world Catholicism, like the Catholics around the world?
Yeah, very impactful. I mean, one of the things about the Catholic Church that is probably something of a disanalogy with Islam is that we have a centralized authority, the Pope and the bishops. And so when they do proclaim something, then that becomes normative throughout the global Catholic Church. And one of the interesting things that happen is in the past 50 years or so, there has been a global wave of democratization where countries have become democracies where they were once dictators. And well, the fascinating thing is that in many of these countries, the Catholic Church led the way to democratization. They were the ones out in the streets in the nonviolent, people power movements, some people coursing through the streets of dictatorships. Often it was, guys with funny hats who were bishops and nuns who were, like the ones who were facing down tanks in the Philippines and so forth. Or you think of the pilgrimages of John Paul II in Poland under communism, a huge factor in bringing down the communist regime, and other places where in a study that some colleagues and I did of 78 democratization movements, we found that in 48 religious leaders took the lead, but in 36 of those 48 they were Catholic. And so once the church proclaimed religious freedom and embraced human rights, then Catholic movements around the world could become engines of human rights and democratization. And so this is also true in Latin American countries such as Chile in the opposition to Pinochet, Brazil, where the church was kind of a force for democratization in so many countries precisely because of this change in teaching.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Professor Philpott. We are going to sort of turn to audience questions soon, but I do want to give our other two participants, our speakers, Tasneem and Professor Fadel, an opportunity to either respond to each other, to you, and all three of you to have, I just want to create some space in case you want to respond to each other's comments at all before we turn it over to the audience.
I would like a brief response, but I wanted to give Tasneem an opportunity first.
Please go ahead. I'm curious to hear your response.
Yeah, I was going to say, just to be very clear for the audience, Islam has never had a problem with people not being Muslims. They're free to worship generally how they want to worship, right? That's not the problem. What Islam traditionally has sought is to have non-Muslims incorporated into a Muslim public sphere such that they are subject to the rules of Islamic law in the secular sphere, right? Now, so as I was saying, they understood this as treating them as Muslims, right? And this was to ensure security, among other things, but also because they thought they were giving them their rights and securing their rights for them. So their religion was perfectly fine and tolerated so long as, from the Muslim perspective, they didn't bring their blasphemy to us. Sorry, I don't mean to use that, but that was how they understood it, right? Christians are perfectly free to worship as they wish, but just don't bring it into Muslim cities. Don't display the cross in Muslim cities, et cetera, et cetera. This is the language that classical Muslim jurists use. And so it's a restricted idea of religious freedom comparison in comparing to modern post-World War II secular notions of freedom, right? But historically speaking, Muslim world had a lot more religious pluralism than Europe. That's just a fact. In the modern, what makes it difficult to sustain that kind of traditional religious pluralism in the modern world is that the modern world requires a degree of social integration and cooperation that just goes way beyond anything in the Middle Ages. So in the Middle Ages, all you had to do was pay your taxes. Basically, once a year, the tax collector showed up, took a portion of your produce and left. Today, they have to go to school. They have to be trained to be citizens. They have to be trained to be productive. They have to be trained to work shoulder to shoulder with everybody in society, right? And so this kind of close integration of people with different religious ideas is something that Muslim jurists never thought of in the past. And so this is where the tension comes in, because in the view of Muslim jurists, historically, non-Muslims sort of lived over there, we lived over here, because as I said, when they formulated these rules, that was the reality because they were a vanishingly small minority. Now, of course, that broke down over time, right? Over time, as more and more non-Muslims became Muslim, these walls of separation broke down, and so many of these rules lost effect. But still, certain things are very sensitive, right? So, lots of traditional Muslim communities do not want to have a church built next to them. This is a site of constant friction in rural Egypt, for example. I'm an Egyptian, but I want to say rural Egypt because it's peculiar to the countryside. And this is why the state is so important, because the state is weak. Even though Christians would have the right to do this, the state isn't able to enforce these sorts of rights, right? So oftentimes you get these communal riots, but they almost never happen in Cairo. Why is that? It's not that Cairenes are morally superior people. It's just that there's a lot more institutionally advanced development in the city than you have in the countryside. And that's why I'm saying it's really not a theological problem. Of course, it's important to have good theological arguments, but I would say we don't need to look to people today. There have been theological arguments about or arguments for religious freedom in a pretty robust way for over 100 years. It's just that the level of development, social development, has been disappointing. Let me just put it that way.
Yeah,
right?
Professor Fadel, you've talked about, social and political development and it being weak in, some of these Muslim majority countries, such as in Egypt. And I'm wondering, and you say that it's not a theological issue, that there are certain people who are socialized into having a problem with the church being built right next to them, because, and this whole notion of religious freedom cannot really take root because the state itself is weak around enforcement. But my question is, it was interesting to hear Professor Philpott speak about how the Catholic Church was able to impact notions of democracy in the Catholic world. And I know the place and position of the Catholic Church is very different from religious institutions within the Muslim world and their influence on the populace around them. But I'm wondering, especially in places like Egypt, where the state is weak, can religious institutions like Al-Azhar or even transnational ones, can they play any role in shaping or helping the state shape some of these norms around these questions? I mean, just very recently, I think President Sisi came up with his 5-year human rights agenda for Egypt, in which he said, he talked about religious freedom and all minorities, Christian minorities and, religious minorities are free to do whatever they want and things like that. He came up with that, but he also said, and I quote, "But will a society that has been conditioned to think in a certain way for the last 90 years accept this?" Right? So even if he has come up with this new agenda, these new laws, for a society to accept something like that, which is so fundamentally different from what it's experienced, do you think there's a role for contemporary Muslim institutions to sort of shape that thinking?
I look, we have to be, look, let me just say one thing about the role of the Catholic Church, which I have tremendous respect for the Catholic Church. But the reality is the Catholic Church was a latecomer to democracy only when it saw that it was beneficial to it, right? So it saw that democracy and religious freedom could be beneficial to the church. Like it saw the example of the United States, basically. So the United States was different than France. And so the church learned that it could coexist with certain kinds of modern secular democracies, not all, right? Certainly not communism, right? Certainly not, maybe laic France, I don't know, right? But that's really, really crucial to understand. So it wasn't as if the Catholic Church just woke up one day and had this theological breakthrough about democracy that it was impervious to before. It had some real kind of opportunity to experience learning in that regard, okay? You ask about the role of Al-Azhar in Egypt. Well, first of all, Al-Azhar is an Egyptian institution. It's like any Egyptian institution. It's riddled with corruption, it's weak, very ineffective, etc. It's really not an independent, it doesn't have much room to play as an independent role, a body, but to the extent that it does, it acts as a bureaucracy it seeks out first and foremost to protect the interests of its immediate constituency as a political actor, right? So it has a huge political constituency that it's going to be trying to serve. So I wouldn't look for it to be a big source of change because, it doesn't have the capacity to do that, right? Again, the Egyptian state, I don't want to get into tirade about the failures of the Egyptian state, but is it really conceivable to be a human rights respecting state when you don't invest in things like education and healthcare and social security and all these other things? It's just kind of nonsense. It's just, as far as I'm concerned, it's just sort of like, window dressing. Because, the typical argument is to blame the people. We want to be human rights respecting, but our people are so backwards, is kind of what Cece is saying. So, well, why don't you teach them to be better? Or why don't you give them more opportunities to be better? Well, can't do that. So.
Great, thank you. I just want to give Tasneem an opportunity in case you want to jump in at all. Tasneem, please feel free to do so. And then we can perhaps turn it over to the audience. We do have a question from the audience. Tasneem, would you like to say something?
I just want to share a brief reflection. Even talking about Dr. Philpott, the categorizations that you offered were useful. And I think that a lot of times, when we think of the Islamist select group of Muslim countries, that their justification is based on theology or tradition. But I think that when it comes to questions of treatment of religious minorities or apostasy or stoning and hand cutting, that a lot of times it's really not a theological issue as much as it is a reaction to Western imperialism and colonialism and a desire to really reflect an identity in a way that, regardless if it's true or not to the Muslim identity today, but it's sort of in reaction that we're going to commit to what you see, what you fear of us as as this Muslim state. And so I think it's what I'm trying to say is that it's not really a legal or theological issue at the end of the day, but a lot of times it is more a question of identity. It's more of a question of political reactions and really a deep history of imperialism, colonialism, and a lot of the injustices faced within the Muslim world.
I'm sure Professor Philpott would like to respond to that, but I think I'm going to turn it over to the audience now. So we have Khalid Rahman from New York City who'd like to address this to the panel. Please address the treatment of minority Muslim sects within the larger Muslim community. And he does say, and I'll just sort of read his comment as well, which is sort of tied into that. He addresses to Mr. Philpott. The Catholic Church cannot be compared to the Muslim faith in general. However, the Shia sect is more like Catholics for having the Ayatollah, you mean like the central religious authority, and following the edicts of the single spiritual political authority. The majority Sunni sect is not like the Catholics. So I guess Mr. Khalid Rahman's question is, can you talk about the treatment of minority Muslim sects within the larger Muslim community? So perhaps either Professor Fadel or Tasneem, if you'd like to go.
Is there a particular concern angle that you're looking to address?
Let's see.
No, I'm not. I'm sorry, let me put my camera on. No particular concern, but I thought that it is relevant to the discussion, or maybe it isn't if you're talking about non-Muslim communities within the Muslim communities. I see a whole lot of problem within our own Muslim majority countries. Particularly, I'm from Pakistan originally, the way Shias are treated, let alone how the Christians are treated in Pakistan. So there's a whole lot of issues there, and I thought that, whether if that was within the purview of the panel, if they could address that.
I'd be happy to say something about that. I mean, I think there's been a lot of focus on non-Muslims, but in many ways, I mean, I think, again, if we're going to make parallels about religious freedom arises largely out of dissidents within the majority community. Minorities are a secondary concern. And so in places like Egypt, a lot of people who actually suffer from persecution on religious grounds are members of the majority community, but hold dissident religious views. Like on one hand, they could be sort of, Muslim Brotherhood types who are, said they're terrorists, or people who want to say, express unorthodox religious views, right? Some, they claim they might be atheists or agnostics or something like that. They can be punished by the Egyptian state too, and have been. Likewise, there have been historically in Egypt in the last 15 years, a certain kind of moral panic about Shiism from time to time. Of course, the situation in Pakistan is horrible, very, very, very bad. And, unfortunately, it's part and parcel, I think, of the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran, where each one of them is sort of fanning the flames of sectarian hatred and exploiting sectarian divisions. But this is something that I just want to state for the record. There are real sectarian, really profound sectarian differences between Shiis and Sunnis on really, really, really important questions. And so most of the time, reasonable people don't want to bring them up, right? They just want to ignore them for the sake of social peace. And so when you have countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran that are intentionally muddying the water, right, it creates lots of conflict. And sadly, they play out their battles in countries like Pakistan and Lebanon, which they use as proxies for their own fight. So, pray that there's some sort of rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I mean, that's the easiest way to hope for something like this in Pakistan to calm down.
Professor Fadel, there is another question for you, directed at you, but I will come back to that question in just a little bit. We have Rosie McMahon who asks, and this is for anyone on the panel who wants to respond. Generally speaking, traditional religious leaders are male leaders. Look at the Marrakesh Declaration. In a discussion about religious freedom, I wonder, where are the women? How do we move toward freedom without their voices in leadership positions? Maybe Tasneem would like to take that, and also Professor Philpott, if you want to sort of talk about that within the Catholic tradition as well, that would be great.
I don't think I disagree. I think I ask myself that all the time. And I think this is something that is being recognized within both the Muslim community and religious communities at large. And I think there has been, at least in the North American context, very much an effort to offer more educational opportunities for women to rise to leadership positions. But until those, I mean, I think that at least when we're talking about the Muslim world, education overall is an issue. So it's not, I don't think it's specifically a women problem. It affects the population at large. And I think along with a lot of the other social institutions that need to be built, that this is something that needs to be definitely focused on.
Thank you. Professor Philpott, would you like to talk about it from within the Catholic context?
Yes, well, certainly. Yeah, I think it is very important that I think religious freedom and opportunities for women and women taking leadership positions, go hand in hand. I think it's something that we still need to make progress in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, the priesthood is male, and that means bishops and the Pope are going to be male. But I think there are lots of ways, though, in which prominent leadership positions can and should be held by women. I think we need to make progress towards doing that much more. And our current Pope had promised progress on that. I think less has occurred than one might have hoped, but I think it's something that needs to happen. I think we do see a lot of lay women leadership in Catholic organizations that are not simply the church, but are organizations that are Catholic, often that are in civil society and promoting different kinds of causes. I think women also play an important role in leadership in various. There's a high number of women in various diocesan, which is the kind of local unit of geographical unit, diocesan leadership positions. So there's progress, but more needs to be made.
And I will just add, Rosie, in Pakistan, where I'm from, there is this huge institution, and it's somewhat of a recent phenomenon, maybe about 20, 25 years ago, when it was first established. It's called the Al-Huda Institute. It is run by a woman and it has many branch schools around the country, and it only trains women religious leaders. And these are highly educated Muslim women who are being trained in the religious sciences and Islamic jurisprudence, and it's a huge phenomenon, and it sort of has come up over the past 20 years. The interesting thing is that the woman who runs it, she wears a niqab. She's extreme, so not just the hijab, but she also covers her face. And so she has a very, very conservative interpretation of a religious text and scripture. And so even all of these women emerging as religious leaders has been a source of some consternation within the larger Muslim or Pakistani society, only because there's a certain interpretation that she goes by and is sort of spreading that word. I personally think that it is religious empowerment for women, but I wonder how, in other countries, like here in the West, they would see something like that as more of a threat, perhaps. Even in Pakistan, it's considered, well, is that the kind of religious leadership among women that we're looking for? I personally think it's all about empowerment, and however women can find it, it's legitimate. So anyway, just wanted to put that out there. So Professor Fadel, there's another question for you. This is by Sohan D'Souza. They ask, I don't understand the bit about non-Muslims not being held accountable by the state regarding Islamic practices like praying, fasting, etc. Are Muslims supposed to be compelled by the state to pray, fast, etc.? If so, does that not violate the Muslims' own religious freedom? Interesting question.
Right. Okay. So this is, again, I think one of the reasons why it's important to understand how Islam is different than, let's say, Christianity. So my understanding of the Catholic Church, and Professor Philpott can correct me if I'm wrong, is that there was a great deal of concern about doctrinal propriety. So the church was very keen on making sure that people believed the right things. In Islam, there was not nearly as much concern about doctrinal propriety. So you had a lot of religious freedom in the sense of people could say pretty much a lot of crazy things from an Islamic Orthodox perspective about God. But what was important was people perform their legal obligations. So there were certain ritual obligations that as a Muslim, you are supposed to perform. And so in principle, right, you could suffer some sort of legal penalties, right? In theory, somebody who refused to pray could be punished. Now, was that actually done? I don't really know. But for example, a much more clear way this was done was in court, in judicial procedure, a witness had to be upright. And so somebody who didn't observe ritual practice, by definition, wouldn't be upright, and so couldn't be a witness in court, for example. To this day, in most Muslim countries, you can't break the fast of Ramadan openly. That is a crime. You will be punished if you are eating, drinking, or smoking in daylight hours during Ramadan, right? So yes, the state had a role in enforcing public ritual. That was actually one of its most important functions, was to organize public ritual and engage in some kind of disciplining process to make sure people, society generally observed these rules. Now, that wasn't considered a violation of Muslim religious freedom, just like it's not a violation of your freedom if you get a fine for speeding, right? Because it was considered a legitimate law. God told us to pray 5 times a day. You're a Muslim, you believe that obligation, right? You admit that this is something, a duty you owe God. And so it is legitimate to punish you for not doing it. I mean, that's essentially the view from the internal Islamic perspective. There's not a religious freedom issue for a Muslim because the Muslim admits that this is an obligation that binds him.
Professor Philpott or Tasneem, would you like to elaborate at all?
I mean, I think to me the kind of the essence of religious freedom is that there's no kind of coercion of beliefs or coercion of the religious practices that people perform on account of their beliefs, and I think that's the core thing. I think that and so religious societies have. I think in the West there's been an evolution. I think up to say the 19th century, even Western societies would have had similar kind of laws that Professor Fadel described, where if you didn't go to church on Sunday morning, there might be some kind of civil penalty, or if you spoke blasphemy, there might be some kind of penalty at the hands of the law, or what have you. Of course, most of that has changed, but I think the key to religious freedom is about today, as it's been articulated, is primarily the respecting the belief of others, or even of dissenters within one's faith, who in conscience reach respecting the conclusions that they reach in conscience, and then the kind of religious practices that go with that, and so yeah, I think that's the essence of it.
Great. I'd like to just encourage the audience, if you have more questions, please submit them in the chat, or because we're a small enough group, you can also just unmute yourself and you can also say them out loud. But Professor Fadel, we have a dissension here in the community. Khalid Rahman says, I disagree with Professor Fadel. The divine injunctions are of 2 types. The personal Sharia, rules like praying, fasting, etc., are one's responsibility to God. The state has no role telling us about those roles. The societal Sharia, duties to other human beings, are the responsibility of the state. How would you respond to that?
I'm not expressing my own opinion. I'm just telling you what classical Muslim jurists and medieval Muslim jurists said about this matter. So things like, I don't want to it sounds like a little inside baseball, but Muslims will know what I'm talking about. Nawafil prayers, right? That's between you and God. But fard prayers, farz, as you would say in South Asia, that's not between you. It is between you and God, but because it's considered farz, what it means is that an element of coercion is permissible, right? Now that coercion can simply be, that the judge orders you, why aren't you praying, right? And sort of embarrasses you in front of everybody, right? But in principle, the government, the public has the right to criticize people for not fulfilling their duties. And the public prayers are one of those things that, the state is responsible to make sure is being adhered to, right? As for, private prayers and supplementary fasting and excess charity, yes, that's completely personal, right? But in the classical doctrine, right, I mean, the government builds mosques, pays prayer leaders, it shuts down the marketplaces on Friday. It doesn't allow commerce to take place during Friday prayer, right? And these are all things designed to induce observance of the obligatory rituals.
I'm sorry, Dr. Fadel, I'm not a scholar, I'm just an ordinary person. I think that is carried on in certain societies, like in Saudi Arabia. I don't think that Islam calls for it. You can encourage people, you can recommend to them, you can suggest to them that it is prayer time, but no one can punish me or put me in jail because I did not pray on time or did not pray the 5 times prayer. However, if I steal somebody's property, if I hurt my neighbor, if I carry on some other commissions against the society, state has all the right and the duty to punish me. The personal responsibilities, which I call personal sharia, the praying, the fasting, the paying of the zakah, is between me and my creator. If I don't do it, he'll take care of me, he'll punish me, he'll reward me. State has nothing to do with it. This is my understanding of the Quran, that there is no compulsion. There is no compulsion.
That's just not what the rules were. I mean, I have nothing. I don't want to say that you're wrong. I'm not trying to say you're wrong. I'm just saying that that's not historically what the rules were.
Right, but Professor Fadel, I think what Khalid Rahman Sahab is sort of trying to understand is what you're referring then to is classical historical jurisprudence around this subject, not the way it is currently manifest in Muslim majority countries. Because I mean, again, in Pakistan as well, I mean, prayer is something so personal. Nobody can, come inside your home and to ensure that you're praying. And also in the public realm, if you're not praying, that is not something that is punished.
Of course, but let me just, I mean, again, what I would tell you, look, I study legal history, etc. What jurists would say is, look, because not everybody has to go pray at the time that prayer is called, right? But the state has an obligation to make sure that prayers are organized and that people attend them so that the prayers are conducted. And so if that happens, then everybody else is excused. But the prayer has to be conducted in a public fashion at its appropriate time. So that if nobody went to the mosque, let's say, for a namaz, the government should do something about it. That's what jurists would say, right? If nobody went, not everybody has to go.
But in
not
practice,
everybody has to go. Not everybody has to go. Not everybody has to go, right? But enough have to go so that you can conduct the prayer according to its rules. There's minimum number of people, etc. I'm just telling you what the rules are. Right?
I mean, yes.
I'm judgment. All right. I'm just telling you what the rules are, and I'm trying to answer the question: why isn't that considered a violation of religious freedom? Well, because the law always compels us to do our duty, and we consider that to be consistent with our freedom. So Muslim jurists understood that the establishment of public ritual is part of the duty of the Muslim community. So the Muslim community cannot allow it to lapse.
Okay. All right. Does anybody else have a question or a comment? Oh, I think we have. Sohan D'Souza has a question for Dr. Alkiek regarding caliphs being against non-Muslim conversions to Islam because it reduced their military tax base. Does that not indicate an exploitative relationship in Dhimma? Also, don't Muslims also fund the military?
Yes, to the latter questions. Muslims are the primary funders, and I didn't mean. I gave that example as more of, I think, just theoretical in terms of the relationship. It's not, I mean, they're not making that much money off the jizya realistically. And so I don't think it would be, I mean, I guess it really depends how you define exploitative relationship. Obviously, there's an exchange, and obviously they're getting money out of it. So that is not something undeniable. And that's not, I don't think, something that would be odd, that you're getting physical protection and that you, and this is a reality historically, this is, you're at war constantly. There's no periods of prolonged peace. And so receiving physical military protection in exchange for money, yeah, I mean, exploitative both ways, if that's the case. But I think at the end of the day, the Muslims were the source of the funding, and that the jizya was there to contribute to that.
So, I mean, I find this really interesting, and I really appreciate your comments, Dr. Alkiek. And but I'm still wondering. I mean, we've talked a lot about classical jurisprudence and what the rules were and how they were developed in historical times. And but again, I just don't hear about, other than the Marrakesh Declaration, right? That was, as Tasneem mentioned, were religious leaders, political leaders, not necessarily jurists, perhaps, right, who were actually contributing to development of Islamic law, talk about the rights of religious minorities. So other than that, what has there been any movement within the Islamic world, within the Islamic jurisprudential community in contemporary times, where people have sort of brought into the present or contemporary times notions of equal citizenship or jurisprudence around the rights of religious minorities in Muslim majority countries? I mean, I know there's this whole discipline called the fiqh al-aqliyat, you know, the jurisprudence around Muslim religious minorities in Western lands and how they should be and what their conduct should be and what their relationship to the state is. But I feel there's I mean, either I just don't know, or I'm not hearing about any movement regarding the rights of religious minorities in Muslim majority countries.
I'll let Professor Fadel add to this, but I mean, I think the example that you gave, the creator of the concept of fiqh al-aqliyat, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who's one of the world's largest Muslim scholars. In fact, he talks openly about this concept of various concepts of wataniya, of what it means, the Muslim state, what it means today, but of citizenry. And that's essentially that religious minorities or non-Muslims, to be more open, can enjoy like practically all rights of equal citizenship. So I think that's there. I think the tension is not about religious scholars acknowledging that. And you have even, academics like Khalid Abou Fadl talking about not just tolerance, but equality. And there's a lot of discussion there, but I think it always boils down to the practicality of enforcing that, which, as Professor Fadel mentioned earlier, that is in most cases impractical based off of the social and economic situations in many of the Muslim countries today.
Yeah, I think the modern citizenship idea does call for in the modern religious freedom, the human rights law does call for a kind of equality that does take a few steps beyond even robust and important levels of tolerance historically. So in the Muslim tradition, in many places there were the millet tradition, there were the dhimmi tradition, and yes, in the Ottoman Empire was many in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, it was far more tolerant than say medieval Europe. In fact, Spanish, and when Muslims and Jews were expelled from medieval Spain, many went to the Ottoman Empire, and found far more, found religious tolerance, and in a way that even Christians enjoyed there, in a way that Muslims and Jews did not in the West, and so forth. And but Christianity also has a tradition, even in the Middle Ages, of kind of also a teaching of respect for people who are not Christians, Muslims and Jews, and the traditional teaching was always, you couldn't convert people through force, and sometimes in practice that was not honored, but that was always the teaching, and then a certain level of respect for practice, kind of like the Zimmi status was due to non-Christians. But I think in both the modern human rights law of religious freedom, and also the principle that the Catholic Church eventually came to endorse, would in fact though call for full citizenship, that a religious minority in a country can't be second class or disadvantaged in any way with respect to the laws, either in the practice of their religion or in their access to jobs or government positions or what have you. And so I think the full citizenship rights, I think in that kind of modern human rights understanding, is what is called for. But there are ways in the West also that we sometimes fall short of those standards. I mean, in the United States, there is Asma Udin has done good work on kind of a rise of Islamophobia, where you have certain kind of very kind of conservative Christians in the U.S. who are saying Muslims are not really religion, that it's not really a religion, it's an ideology. And then you can then organize the campaign to prevent the building of the mosque in Tennessee or what have you. Well, that's not religious freedom, right? And so it's, it's got to be an across-the-board consistent principle.
If I could just jump in. There's actually a discrete question that's very easy to answer, so I'd like to do that. I don't want to run away from your question, Mahlaka, but there is a question about, is jizya still expected from non-Muslims? Well, the Ottoman Empire abolished jizya in the first third of the 19th century, maybe a little after 1833, maybe 1840, I think, the Golhan Decree. But again, part of what happened when they abolished jizya is that they began conscripting non-Muslims, right? And so this was kind of the thing. So we can talk about the history of attempts to create equal citizenship in the Ottoman Empire. That's a very discrete question. So in the 19th century, it's very interesting. As the Ottoman Empire was modernizing, right? This is what I was talking about, how the nature of cooperation under modern conditions requires a great deal of integration that goes well beyond anything people in the Middle Ages conceived of, right? So when you wanted to have a modern army, you needed to be able to mobilize your population on a scale that was inconceivable before, right? So it wasn't as though like Mehmet Ali, who was the viceroy of Egypt, had some kind of abstract commitment to religious freedom. He needed people in the army. So he started drafting Christians. Christians weren't exactly thrilled about it, right? I mean, some were, but a lot weren't, right? So equality, the demands of equality are also sometimes resisted by the minority religion, because that opens them up to assimilation, which is another side to this problem, right? And so we have to understand that resistance to a kind of secular ideal of citizenship is not solely from Muslims. Actually, in many cases, it comes from religious minorities because they're afraid of assimilation as a result, right? So the church in Egypt is extremely strong, and they are very reluctant to give up any of their prerogatives over the Christian population, right? And so this is part of the problem. You asked about religious, are Muslim leaders in the Muslim world thinking about religious freedom, et cetera. I just want to stress religious freedom really is a product of certain sociological circumstances, despite my affirmation of it as an abstract principle, We can all agree as an abstract principle, it's very fundamental. But if we just look at our country, the United States, even though I'm sitting in Canada, in our country, our own conception of robust religious freedom is relatively new to the history of the United States, right? As a result of the increasing pluralism sociologically because of waves and waves and waves of immigration, right? If you go to the 18th century, the 19th century, it was almost entirely a Christian republic. Justice Story, who was author of the most important commentary on the Constitution, in his discussion of the First Amendment, he says explicitly, this was not intended to protect Muslims and Jews. It was intended to create peace among Christian denominations, right? So our idea of religious freedom, we naturally sort of internalize it as being natural, but it's really the product of a very, very long and specific history with lots of contingency that's just not, this. If you go to Morocco and you ask a Moroccan religious scholar, why aren't you talking about religious freedom? Like, what are you talking about? 99.9% of the people are Muslims, right? And you're talking about minority religious rights. It's not, when you look at England and the battles that happened, one of the most moving things I've ever experienced was I go to Oxford and you see where people were burned at the stake, right? So religious freedom developed through a long struggle. And, for good or for ill, Muslim societies, that's kind of alien to them. And so I think it's a wrong-headed to assume we can take the product of 400 years of a specific religious political conflict in the West and just apply it to other societies and think you can have the same outcome.
But Professor Fadel, you say that this was something that developed over 400 years within the West, but even within the Islamic legal tradition, it has always, and starting with the Charter of Medina, the Muslim world has always grappled with this notion of religious minorities within its lands, right? It's not something that is so alien. It's something, and there's been some evolution around that. I think it was something that the Muslim world had to contend with from the very beginning, with the existence of Jewish tribes and then later other places that it conquered and things like that. So it's not something, so we've been developing that in our own context as well. Yes, I think what we're contending with is how to incorporate this into the modern nation state. That is the problem. I feel not that this is something, this whole idea is so alien that we've never had to deal with it before, and now we have to.
Yeah, but hold on. What I said was from the very beginning, Muslims always accepted the idea that non-Muslims had a right to exist as distinct communities and worship the way they wanted to worship. That's not the issue. What you're asking about is modern conceptions of religious freedom. Those modern conceptions of religious freedom arose in response to the need to be able to govern a religiously diverse society. It arose in response to that particular problem. How do you govern a society that has 100 different religions? That's the United States. Our tradition of religious freedom grew in response to that practical problem. What I'm trying to say is that intellectual concepts, legal concepts, theological concepts develop in dialogue with, in dialectic with social conditions. So if the social conditions are radically different, right, in Muslim societies, it's hard to imagine why you would end up with the same outcome. Now, there's also another very discrete question that I'd like to answer.
Yeah. If you could say the question out loud.
Yes. Is there any difference in Islamic law regarding tolerating religious minorities who are people of the book versus tolerating, let's say, religions of the East, Buddhism or Hinduism? Very good question. So there is disagreement about this among Sunnis. I don't know what the Shia position is, but in Sunnism, we have 4 different schools of Islamic law. There's the Hanafis, the Malikis, the Shafi'is, and the Hanbalis. So the Malikis and the Hanafis, are the 2 oldest. The Hanafis are the ones that predominate in Central Asia and South Asia, in the Indian subcontinent. And in their view, anybody can be a dhimmi. It doesn't have to be a Christian or a Jew, right? Same view of the Malikis. Anybody can be a dhimmi, doesn't have to be a Christian or a Jew. The Shafi'is and the Hanbalis, however, believe it can only be a Christian or a Jew.
Okay, so there's
And a Zoroastrian, excuse me, and Zoroastrian.
Zoroastrian. So there's a difference of opinion there. I would be very interested to hear Professor Philpott. And yes, Professor Philpott, please, I know you want to respond to Professor Fadel and Tasneem. Also, please just feel free to jump in. But I'd also like to really hear about then the trajectories of the West Africa 7 that Professor Philpott had referred to earlier in terms of, what is it about their trajectories that there is a lot of religious freedom, and and so I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, one thing I wanted to make an observation based upon the conversation so far, where we're talking about religious freedom, and sometimes I think perhaps we're crossing the line and confusing two different kinds of reasoning. So many centuries ago, Aristotle made a distinction between theoretical reason and practical reason. And theoretical reason is when we seek to describe the world. And so that is the work of the social scientist and the sociologist. And so the sociologist or the historian might look back and say, well, these, religious freedom or different kinds of religious freedom arrangements, religious state arrangements, they all arise under different kinds of sociological conditions. So you have to look at whether people are rural or urban or poor, whether they lived in this era or that era. Or you might describe the kind of historical and sociological conditions that led to the development and religious freedom in the United States or the Catholic Church or what have you. And most of Professor Fadel's and Dr. Alkiek's observations, mostly I would agree with, and that the existence of religious freedom does depend upon sociological and historical conditions. But that all occurs within the realm of theoretical reason, which is, that of the sociologist or the historian or the social scientist. But there's also practical reason, which is reason about the way things ought to be, which is moral reasoning. And there I would argue that as a matter of justice, that's the grounds on which I would argue for the validity of religious freedom as a matter of justice, that religious freedom is something that attends to human dignity, to the dignity of human persons and human and religious and communities. And it's as a matter of justice that I believe that religious freedom is something that ought to be. So practical reason is about the ought and about what one ought to do, what kind of values we ought to uphold. And now I think both kinds of reasons are important, because you may say in the realm of the ought that there ought to be religious freedom, and yet the social scientist will say, well, you can't, not so fast. You're not going to get it here because of the sociological conditions, or that country showed us that it had to have these historical conditions and so forth. And that's all important, and may well seek to induce caution about having to ready expectations about how soon you will get religious freedom or the chances for religious freedom in this or that place. But nevertheless, in the realm of practical reason, in the realm of moral reason, that's where I would make the claim that religious freedom is in fact universal value, like much similar to other human rights, like the rights against prohibitions of torture or killing innocents in combat, or other things, the slavery, things that have become human rights. I mean, it's sociologists might say, well, this country had slavery because of this reason. These countries had slavery in the modern period because of these kinds of economic developments and so forth. Although that is true as a sociological statement, but as a moral statement, there I would want to say that slavery is something that is universally wrong. And so I think keeping the two different kinds of reasoning separate is very important for clarity. Now, what was the question that you wanted me to address? It was
about the West Africa 7.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So here we can do some sociological analysis on the theoretical reason side. So I think it's very interesting that you have these very religious, deeply devout countries that are, that have high levels of religious freedom. They do have religious minorities, Christian minorities, Hindu, Buddhist in some cases. And yet there's deep respect for these minorities. The religious leaders regularly get together in a council They often practice holidays together and festivals together. They sometimes intermarry. And so there's deep religiosity, but also deep respect for the other. Now, I think you can tell a historical story about how this happened. One reason is because of the way that Islam came to these countries. And so in the case of the Arab world and Northern Africa, it largely came through conquest in the centuries after Muhammad. But in these countries, it was different. They came not through conquest, but through small bands of traders and missionaries. And because they were small and didn't come with conquering armies, they had to make deals and bargains with the people around them and with the tribal chiefs and so forth. And because of that, they developed traditions of tolerance and respect between religions. I think that's one. The other thing is that I would say is the prevalence of the Sufi culture. Now, I don't want to overgeneralize and say that Sufis are tolerant everywhere, because they're not. But I do think there is something about Sufi Islam as a kind of spirituality that is conducive to religious freedom, namely a kind of stress on the interiority of religion and the interior experience and the authenticity of the choice for and participation in religion. And I think there's something about that stress on interiority that breeds religious respect for religious freedom as well. One is more likely to say that it can't be imposed, and that the kind of, it has to be deeply interior. And so I think those historical conditions of its arrival and the Sufi culture have fostered it. Now, I will say finally that in the last decade, 15 years or so, these religious freedom arrangements have been under attack from the outside, from groups that are more jihadi or Islamists that are often funded from the outside by Saudi Arabia, or and so there has been a kind of effort to try to undermine it, but by Muslims who consider these arrangements not to be pure enough. And however, mostly I think they've withstood these attacks, but they're still going on, and it is a struggle.
Can I just
Yes, please, Professor Fadel. Yes.
I appreciate the point between theoretical and practical reason, but what I would say is that I think the kind of religious freedom you can expect to see in a society is going to be structured by the sociological makeup of that society. You can't expect Morocco to import, 30% non-Muslim religious adherents. I mean, it would sort of be unreasonable to ask the Moroccan king to start, asking 30% of society to convert to non-Muslim religions so they can now deal with the problem of religious pluralism that the United States had to confront, right? So what I'm trying to suggest is that the way the principle of religious freedom plays in a place where you have a historically homogenous Muslim community is going to be different. So there's a lot of religious freedom, I would say, in Muslim majority countries. It just happens to be all intra-Muslim religious.
Well, I think that's very true. I would say the same about, looking at the historical sociological conditions, and that would shape our expectations. I would say, though, that in the West African countries are also, most of them are actually quite homogeneously Muslim. The minorities are very small, and yet you do have religious freedom. So, and also the other thing I would also say is that societies aren't static. I mean, just because they're one thing frozen at one period in time doesn't mean, they can't change. And just as you gave the good example of Western countries that have changed over the course of history, it's also possible for, history isn't a kind of, countries aren't frozen into what they are. I don't think
that's why I was trying to talk about the role of development or lack thereof.
Sure, yeah.
Is very important, because development increases the possibilities for individual freedom, right? You're not nearly as dependent on your neighbors for everything, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah,
choices aren't nearly as there's a lot more room for individual choice because it's not existential or less existential.
Right, development as freedom, as Amartya Sen has written about.
I will say one more thing, though. And one of the things in my interest in the Christian tradition that I discovered was, many people think religious freedom is a very late arrival in history. But one of the things I uncovered was that there was some thinkers in the very early church in the 3rd and 4th centuries who, in fact, did endorse something almost the equivalent of the modern human right of religious freedom. And, they did so on the basis of, on the basis of doctrines and theologies and so forth. And it did have some historical effect that one of these thinkers was named Lactantius. And when Constantine converted to Christianity, he immediately issued the Edict of Milan, which actually established religious freedom for the pagans. He didn't turn around and persecute the pagans in the way that Christians had just been persecuted. Now, this turned out to be short-lived. It lasted only for a few decades. By the end of that century, religious freedom was kind of, fading pretty rapidly. But nevertheless, the idea of religious freedom and the concept was there. And this was in a deeply pre-modern society that had nothing to do with modern economic development or the Enlightenment or anything like that. So I do think there are examples of, non-developed societies that have embraced religious freedom. Look at the Mughal Empire of India and, very high level of tolerance, or the Ashoka, their early centuries of the Common Era. So also era of high degree of religious tolerance. So I think there are examples of pre-modern and non-Western, deep levels of tolerance.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We are now approaching the end of our program. I just want to give Dr. Alkiek a moment at all, only if she'd like to respond to any of this. And then we'll give her the final word before I thank everybody for their participation.
No, I don't think that there's need to add anything more than what's been said. So thank you.
Well, thank you all so much. Each one of you added so much to the conversation. I learned a lot. I hope that everybody who joined us did as well. Thank you for providing us with contending perspectives at some point, but wherever the tension is where a lot of learning happens. So I want to thank Professor Fadel, Dr. Alkiek, and Professor Philpott for your insights today.